And the U.S. introduces a bill to sanction violators of Washington Accords signed between the DRC and Rwanda. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Welcome to Africa Live. The details on those stories coming up in just a moment. But first, here's Penina Karibe with the day's business headlines. Penina.
Thank you, Beatrice. Coming up on Africa Live Business tonight. U.S. company Evolution Energy secures a deal for cobalt uptake in DR Congo. And the Africa CEO Forum opens in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. I'll have details of those stories and plenty more later on in the bulletin. For now, I'll hand you back to Beatrice.
Penina, thank you. Chinese President Xi Jinping has held a welcome ceremony for U.S. President Donald Trump in Beijing. The trip marks the first visit to China by a U.S. president in almost 9 years.
At the square outside the Great Hall of the People, a welcome ceremony was held for the visiting U.S. president on Thursday morning. The state guest motorcade escorted Donald Trump to the venue. Military band played the national anthems of the U.S. and China. Chinese President Xi Jinping accompanied his U.S. counterpart to inspect the People's Liberation Army Guards of Honor. The two leaders then watched the formations of the PLA Guards of Honor. U.S. President Trump is on a 3-day state visit to China at the invitation of President Xi. This is the first U.S. presidential visit to China in almost 9 years, and Trump's second since his first in November 2017.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has held talks with U.S. President Donald Trump at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Their talks lasted for 2 hours and 15 minutes.
President Xi noted that profound changes unseen in a century are accelerating and the international landscape is increasingly marked by turbulence and transformation. Can China and the United States transcend the Thucydides trap and forge a new model of major country relations? Can the two sides work together to address global challenges and inject greater stability into the world? Can they focus on the well-being of both peoples and the future of humanity and jointly create a brighter future for bilateral relations? The Chinese president said these are questions posed by history, by the world, and by the people. They're also defining questions of our era that leaders of major powers must answer together. President Xi Jinping expressed willingness to work with President Trump in steering the giant ship of China-US relations in the right direction and make 2026 a historic and landmark year for bilateral ties. President Xi reiterated China's commitment to the stable, healthy, and sustainable development of China-US relations. He said he and Trump have agreed to work toward a constructive bilateral relationship of strategic stability. This will provide strategic guidance for China-US relations over the next 3 years and beyond. President Xi hoped this will be welcomed by their two countries and the international community. He defined the constructive relationship of strategic stability as a positive stability with cooperation as the mainstay, sound stability with moderate competition, a constant stability with manageable differences, and an enduring stability with promises of peace. A constructive China-US relationship of strategic stability is not merely a slogan, but a course of action from both sides moving toward each other. President Xi said China-US economic ties are mutually beneficial and win-win in nature. In the face of differences and friction, equal-footed consultation is the only correct choice. He noted Wednesday's meeting in Republic of Korea, where China and U.S. economic and trade teams achieved generally balanced and positive outcome. The Chinese president urged both sides to preserve the hard-won positive momentum in place. China's door to opening up will only open wider. American businesses are participating in China's reform and opening up, and China welcomes stronger mutually beneficial cooperation with the United States. President Xi called on China and the U.S. to implement the important consensus he has reached with President Trump and to make better use of political, diplomatic, and military communication channels. The two countries should also expand exchanges and cooperation in areas including trade, public health, agriculture, tourism, people-to-people, and law enforcement. President Xi said the Taiwan question is the most important issue in China-U.S. relations. If handled properly, bilateral relations can remain generally stable. If mishandled, they face confrontation or even conflict, putting the entire relationship in jeopardy. He emphasized Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water. Safeguarding peace and stability across Taiwan Strait is the biggest common denominator between China and the United States, and the U.S. must handle the Taiwan question with the utmost prudence. President Trump said it was a great honor to pay a state visit to China, adding that U.S.-China relations are very good. He acknowledged his ties with President Xi as the longest-lasting and best relationship between leaders in the history of U.S.-China relations. He cited their friendly communication and resolution of many important issues. Trump cited President Xi as a great leader, China as a great country, and expressed his deep respect for President Xi and the Chinese people. He said his meeting with President Xi is an important one that has drawn worldwide attention. He's willing to work with President Xi to strengthen communication and cooperation, properly manage differences, open up the best U.S.-China relationship in history, and create an even brighter future for both countries. The United States and China are the world's most important and powerful countries. Through cooperation, the two sides can accomplish many great things for their people and for the world. Trump noted the participation of leading representatives from the American business community on his state visit. He cited their respect for China and strongly encouraged them to expand cooperation with China. He introduced each of the American business leaders to President Xi. The two heads of state also exchanged views on major international and regional issues, including the situation in the Middle East, the Ukraine crisis, and the Korean Peninsula. The two leaders agreed to support each other in successfully hosting this year's APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in Shenzhen and the G20 Summit in Miami.
As Chinese President Xi Jinping held talks with U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday in Beijing, the two leaders formulated guidance for ties between the world's two largest economies to build a constructive bilateral relationship of strategic stability. CGTN's Chao Yunfei speaks with the experts on what a new chapter of relations could bring to the world.
For a stable, healthy and sustainable relationship, China and the United States have set the tone for a new positioning of their ties to build a bilateral relationship of constructive strategic stability. During their talks on Thursday, President Xi Jinping told President Donald Trump that the two countries should work in the same direction. Analysts say stability is an anchor for China and the U.S. to conduct cooperation.
This constructive strategic stability is not only about geopolitics, is not only about international politics. It is more about what can these two countries do to provide a sense of order, perception of order to not only these two countries but the rest of the world.
The meeting touched upon multiple fronts, covering diplomacy, military communication channels, trade, agriculture, and law enforcement. This is an in-person communication between leaders across the Pacific, with heads of state diplomacy serving as a backbone. As President Xi told President Trump, the two sides should make 2026 a historic landmark year that opens a new chapter in China-U.S. relations. Just ahead of the U.S. president's visit to China, the two sides held trade talks in the Republic of Korea. President Xi says the negotiations have yielded positive outcomes that benefit people on both sides.
When you have the two biggest economies in the world working together, you have students, studying in China, learning Chinese. You have Chinese students, contributing to American society, coming to our universities. You're always about seeking these win-win partnerships. And honestly, this is what China has done better than anybody else in the world. We see that, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative that was launched in 2013. China has signed up over 150 countries on that. This is real tangible results.
China has been advocating conversation rather than confrontation. The relationship must be based on equality and mutual respect. President Xi says safeguarding peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is the biggest common denominator between China and the U.S.
When it comes to the core national interest, it is not something for the deals. It is a critical question that China made right lines, our bottom lines, quite clear. So it is a time for China to talk with the United States about what kind of issues will undermine the foundation of the relationship and to avoid miscalculation from the other side.
This is President Trump's first visit to China during his second term at the White House. China says such communication could manage differences, expand cooperation, and bring stability and certainty for a turbulent world. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump have visited the Temple of Heaven in Beijing.
President Xi greeted President Trump outside the Hall of Prayer for Good Harvest. The two heads of state posed for a photo in front of the hall and toured the historic site together. During the tour, President Xi said he and President Trump visited the Forbidden City along Beijing's Central Axis in 2017. The Temple of Heaven was built in the same era as the Forbidden City. Its design embodies the ancient Chinese concept of round heaven and square earth, reflecting the Chinese worldview and philosophy of life. President Xi said ancient Chinese rulers held ceremonies at the Temple of Heaven to pray for peace, prosperity, and favorable weather. The ritual demonstrated the long-held Chinese political philosophy that the people are the foundation of a state, and only when the foundation is solid can the state enjoy peace. President Xi said the Communist Party of China has inherited and developed this people-centered philosophy and has always upheld the fundamental purpose to serve the people wholeheartedly, winning their support and allegiance. President Trump said his visit to the Forbidden City in 2017 remains vivid. He said the Temple of Heaven, standing tall and magnificent for more than 600 years, showcases China's classical architecture and profound culture. He said China and the U.S. are great nations, and so are their people. They should deepen mutual understanding and enhance friendship.
President Xi Jinping held a state banquet at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing to welcome visiting U.S. President Donald Trump. The two leaders both delivered remarks at the event.
In his remarks, President Xi Jinping said China is entering the first year of its 15th five-year plan period. He said more than 1.4 billion Chinese people are advancing Chinese modernization through high-quality development, drawing strength from China's more than 5,000 years of civilization. Xi also noted that this year marks the 250th anniversary of U.S. independence. He said the American people are promoting patriotism, innovation, and pioneering spirit as the country moves toward a new stage of development. Xi said the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the goal of making America great again can advance side by side, benefit one another, and contribute to the world. Referring to the ping-pong diplomacy 55 years ago, Xi said it opened the door to China-U.S. exchanges after more than 2 decades of isolation. He added that stories of openness and cooperation have continued to shape ties between the two countries. Xi said he and President Trump have maintained communication through meetings and phone calls, helping keep bilateral relations generally stable. He said both sides agree that China-U.S. relations are the world's most important bilateral relationship and should be improved, not damaged. President Xi said the two countries benefit from cooperation and both lose from confrontation, adding that they should be partners rather than rivals. He said the two sides agreed to build a constructive relationship of strategic stability, promoting steady, healthy, and sustainable development of bilateral ties. Xi also said mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation are key to the stable development of China-U.S. relations. He said China-U.S. ties concern the well-being of more than 1.7 billion people in the two countries, and also the interests of more than 8 billion people around the world. Trump thanked Xi for the warm hospitality during the visit. He described the trip as important and said the two sides had held positive and constructive discussions. President Trump also said the American and Chinese peoples appreciate and respect each other, adding that stronger cooperation between the two countries can help create a better future for the world.
Well, Africa has been closely following the summit in Beijing. For a more in-depth analysis on this, let's bring in Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and Chief Executive of the Africa Policy Institute. Professor Kagwanja, thank you for joining us on Africa Live. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump, they are meeting, they're holding talks in Beijing. How significant is this meeting in the current geopolitical environment?
I think the world is going through a very turbulent patch where we have this war going on in Iran. We are coming from the crisis in Venezuela, another ongoing war in Ukraine, which have left the world very much divided. Particularly the war in Iran has devastated the global economy in a huge way because of inaccess to the Strait of Hormuz. And a lot of diplomacy was needed, a lot of sober-minded approach to global issues and more solidarity than basically conflict. And therefore, what is happening in Beijing is really salutary, a welcome development, which has a glimmer of hope that the world might begin to look at things with the solidarity. And that's going to ease a lot of the challenges that are facing the world today.
So Chinese President Xi Jinping earlier outlined 4 dimensions for the relations. He emphasized on cooperation and mutual benefit. How do we expect this framework to play out?
Well, the first thing is to find a solution to the crisis in Iran. There doesn't seem to be a solution, if the West or America, for that matter, continue with its war, and Iran seems to be prepared for a long haul. And therefore, the world is going to suffer. There is a major shift in terms of global power, where the U.S. now looks vulnerable. It has never been vulnerable for the last 70 years than it is today. And therefore, there is need, for example, within the framework that President Xi Jinping has defined, we need now to edge closer to those things that bring humanity together than those that divide us. We need to move closer more to peace than to conflict. We need to seek solutions to our differences, not in rhetoric, but in practical solutions to the problems facing humanity. And some of these is essentially are, even issues like climate change, issues of food insecurity globally, issues of energy crisis. All these will require solidarity across the board and across civilizations. And therefore, I think the framework that has been defined by the Chinese president is going to be very useful. And President Trump seems now to be, setting the high horse and basically beginning to see the need for solidarity across civilizations and across populations of humanity.
And what about Africa? What impact could improved U.S.-China relations have, particularly on the continent?
As you know, when the great powers catches a cold, Africa sneezes. And this is no exception. This is basically the reverse. The coming together of the United States and China, is good news to Africa, because the cost of living is going to go to decline. Oil prices had skyrocketed. Now we hope that they're going to come down. Cost of consumer commodities were also high, and basically accentuating the issue of poverty on the continent. Remember, the continent is the main source of some of the vital strategic minerals that are driving the renewable energy revolution. Lithium, cobalt, copper, and so on. This, we hope, is going to open the market for the African continent, including its newly found oil resources. And therefore, we are hopeful that this amity, this coming together of the major powers is going to bring more hope and possibly a more reprieve for countries in Africa that are suffering from the spillover effects of this conflict in the Middle East, the superpower rivalry, and wars within Europe, so to say.
All right, Professor Kagwanja, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's now go to Ethiopia, where UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is attending the UN's 80th anniversary commemoration, as well as the 10th African Union UN Annual Conference. The conference comes at a time when several African countries are facing ongoing conflicts, mass displacement, and economic pressures linked to global instability. CGTN's Wanja Mungai with more on Guterres' dialogue with leaders at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa.
The 10th African Union and UN High-Level Partnership Dialogue at the African Union headquarters. The discussions focused on strengthening cooperation between the African Union and the United Nations in areas including peacekeeping, mediation efforts, and humanitarian response. African Union Commission Chairperson Mohamed Ali Yusuf warned that external interference continues to fuel instability in several parts of the continent, complicating peace efforts led by African institutions.
Most of our crises on the continent are fueled from abroad. Financial resources, ammunition, sometimes even fighters come to fight another war from other continents. It's a real curse for us. All the efforts that the African Union, the UN, we are deploying to contain these crises are exacerbated by this kind of interferences.
The UN chief also raised concerns over Africa's growing debt burden and what he described as unequal global financial structures that continue to limit development financing for many African countries.
Today's global financial architecture is not providing adequate levels of support nor sufficient voice and participation for Africa. Many African countries face vast debt repayments that drain public resources and undermine long-term investment in critical systems.
The discussions also highlighted Africa's long-standing calls for reform of global governance institutions, including the UN Security Council. Guterres reiterated support for greater African representation, describing the continent's exclusion from permanent membership as a historical injustice.
A Security Council that today does not represent geographically the realities of the world. We have 3 European permanent members, 1 North American and 1 Asian, no Latin America, no Africans. Is obviously a Security Council that has a problem of legitimacy, and that brings with it a problem of effectiveness.
The meeting concluded with a peace and security declaration formulation calling for the urgent need for reforms on the UN Security Council in order to realize effectiveness and proper representation. Wanchamungai, CGTN.
Recent U.S. sanctions imposed on former Congolese President Joseph Kabila for reportedly funding the M23 rebels in the east of the DRC have caused divisions in the Central African nation. Congolese authorities described the sanctions as an important step in the fight against impunity, but Kabila and his supporters dismissed them as politically motivated. CGTN's Chris Ochamringa has more from Kinshasa.
Members of the DRC's ruling party took to the streets of Kinshasa earlier this month to show their support for U.S. sanctions against former Congolese President Joseph Kabila. The U.S. accuses Kabila of providing financial and political support to the M23 rebel group, which has captured swathes of territory in eastern Congo and carried out atrocities including executions, rape, torture and forced recruitment. The DRC president has repeatedly accused Kabila of being the brains behind the political wing of the rebel group.
The American sanctions justify what I have been saying all along. They have now noted what I noted some time back. And you shouldn't take the Americans for children. They are people who may know what is happening in our country better than we do.
Under the sanctions, all of Kabila's assets in the U.S. have been frozen, and companies are prohibited from doing business with him. The U.S. says the sanctions are part of a broader effort to support a peace deal it brokered between the DRC and Rwanda last year.
The U.S. sanctions will weaken Kabila's position to a greater or lesser extent and reinforce the Kinshasa government's position. This internally legitimizes the government's position and discourse, but at the same time, it may push Kabila's side to become more radical.
The former Congolese president and his party members have dismissed the sanctions as politically motivated.
The government believes that if anyone criticizes the Washington Accords, the US will deal with him. That's why they are soliciting an international arrest warrant against Kabila. That's absurd. Articles 56 and 57 of our Constitution qualify any accord that deprives citizens of their freedom as null and void.
The US earlier imposed sanctions on the Rwandan army and 4 of its senior officers for backing the M23 rebels. Rwanda denied the accusation. Fighting between Congolese forces and the M23 rebels has continued in eastern DRC despite the sanctions. The M23 rebels recently criticized the United States for failing to act as a neutral mediator in the conflict in eastern Congo. Their leader blamed the U.S. for imposing sanctions on former Congolese President Joseph Kabila and for letting the Kinshasa government get away with violations of a ceasefire deal. His statement casts a shadow over the efforts to end the conflict through a political solution. Chris Ochamringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa. But as yet, it does not have a Republican co-sponsor. Kate Fisher reports from Washington, D.C.
The Stable DRC Act aims to protect the fragile peace agreement between the DRC and Rwanda, negotiated by US President Donald Trump last December. The bill provides the US administration with a broader legal basis to sanction any foreign individual or entity that deliberately undermines the so-called Washington Accords. Rather than create sanctions from scratch, the legislation would expand and formalize sanctions authority, make enforcement more systematic, and tie penalties directly to compliance with the Washington Accords, essentially strengthening the existing framework by widening the list of those sanctioned, increasing congressional oversight, and making it politically harder for future administrations to waive enforcement. Entities that are already under US sanctions include the Rwanda Defense Force and 4 of its senior officials who provided operational support to M23, the rebel group operating in the eastern DRC. M23 rebels and other associated groups are also sanctioned, as well as the former DRC president, Joseph Kabila. The US has also sanctioned companies in the DRC and China associated with minerals trafficking and mining operations that are linked to armed groups. The Stable DRC Act has been introduced amid continued violence in eastern Congo and broader humanitarian concerns, including civilian killings and displacement. Supporters argue the bill would increase pressure on those fueling this conflict and strengthen the enforcement of the Washington Accords, ensuring consequences for those who violate it. But the legislation is in its earliest stages and faces some obstacles. Right now, it appears to be a single-sponsor partisan bill introduced by just one Democratic lawmaker with no publicly listed Republican sponsors. And foreign policy bills focused on Africa often struggle to become top congressional priorities, as lawmakers tend to prioritise other issues like the Middle East, China and Ukraine. Kate Fisher, CGTN, Washington.
And staying in the DRC, Congolese soldiers and allied Wazalendo fighters have advanced into the Ruzizi plains. That's according to local leaders and residents. It follows the withdrawal of M23 rebels from several positions in South Kivu province amid renewed diplomatic efforts. Footage obtained by Reuters shows pickup trucks carrying Congolese soldiers entering the town of Sange and troops patrolling streets on foot and on motorbikes.
Today, with the arrival of the loyalist forces and the presence of the authorities, the town has mobilized and several residents have returned. We appeal to the Congolese government and to partners to come to the aid of the population, which remains unstable until now, because some residents have seen their belongings looted and several houses have been destroyed.
Ghana is implementing a plan to bring home 300 citizens living in South Africa, following what the government says are renewed xenophobic attacks targeting foreigners in parts of the country. President John Dramani Mahama authorized the emergency repatriation exercise, with the country's foreign ministry and High Commission in Pretoria leading the operation. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Many Ghanaians living in South Africa say increasing fear and uncertainty are once again becoming part of daily life, following renewed xenophobic attacks in some communities. The Ghanaian government is now preparing to evacuate at least 300 citizens who requested assistance to return home. But the move has been met with mixed reactions in Accra.
The country, South Africa, should resolve their issues, and there is no need for Ghanaian citizens coming back to the country. All the African citizens are supposed to unite.
The government has to make sure that when the Ghanaians in South Africa come back, they will have jobs to do here. I want them to come back.
Officials in Ghana say the repatriation process is being coordinated with authorities in Pretoria, although a confirmed arrival date for the first batch has not yet been announced. South Africa is home to more than 15,000 Ghanaians, many of whom work in retail, hospitality, transport, construction, and small businesses. Others are students and professionals pursuing opportunities. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned the attacks and called for calm, saying violence against foreign nationals undermines the country's values and stability. The Ghanaian government says it remains in close contact with South African authorities as efforts continue to ensure the safety of its citizens. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Well, let's now go to Penina for a look at the day's business news. Penina.
Thank you, Beatrice. And coming up on Africa Live Business tonight, U.S. company Evolution Energy secures a deal for cobalt uptake in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the Africa CEO Forum opens in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. A U.S. company aspiring to build the first large-scale cobalt processing facility in the Democratic Republic of Congo has announced an agreement that could allow it to source hand-dug metal from the African country. Evolution Energy was a signatory to a memorandum of understanding signed in Madrid on Wednesday that also involves the Democratic Republic of Congo's owned enterprise General du Cobalt, or EGC, and commodity trading giant Trafigura Group. The arrangement establishes what's called a framework for the long-term supply of Congolese cobalt hydroxide to the U.S. That's according to a statement by the three companies. The deal comes 5 months after the U.S. and the DRC concluded a partnership granting U.S. investors preferential access to some of the Central African nations' abundant reserves of metals, including copper, cobalt, lithium, and tantalum. African heads of state and more than 2,000 business leaders, investors and policymakers from over 70 countries have gathered in Kigali for the 2026 Africa CEO Forum. This year's summit is focusing on how Africa can accelerate economic growth through regional integration, investment partnerships and stronger private sector participation. Leaders at the forum will address intra-Africa trade barriers and ways to unlock investment opportunities across key sectors, including infrastructure, energy, finance and technology. The Africa CEO Forum is the continent's largest platform, bringing together governments and the private sector to shape Africa's economic future. Ghana's cocoa sector is facing renewed uncertainty as financial troubles at the country's state-owned company threatens payments to farmers and the entire cocoa supply chain. The crisis is now raising serious concerns about how farmers will survive the season and what it could mean for Ghana's export earnings from one of its most vital cash crops. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports.
Ibrahim Boateng has put in the work. Now he's getting his cocoa beans ready for export. But there is uncertainty spreading through farming communities across Ghana as thousands of cocoa farmers wait to be paid for beans already delivered.
It is now extremely difficult to produce cocoa. So when we do not receive timely payments, it really affects us.
Farmers say delayed payments are making it difficult to prepare for the next production cycle. Many rely on cocoa sales not just for household expenses, but also to pay laborers, repay loans, and maintain their farms ahead of the next season. The state-backed producer buying company, known as PBC, which is mandated to buy cocoa from farmers, is reportedly struggling with mounting debts and a severe cash shortage.
The company currently is facing a $60 million, which translates to around 673 million Ghana cedis in accumulated debt. And as the buyer of last resort, PBC's inability to operate has left most of our cocoa farmers in about 127 districts of the country with unpaid vouchers for over 9,000 bags of cocoa that they've mocked up.
The financial crisis comes at a difficult time for Ghana's cocoa industry. After record price rallies 2 years ago, global cocoa prices have tumbled amid improved harvests in some producing countries and low demand from chocolate manufacturers. Analysts warn the liquidity crunch could have wider implications for Ghana's economy if cocoa purchases continue to slow. The country's cocoa regulator, Cocoa Board, says it is looking to raise $1 billion in domestic bonds to fund cocoa purchases from farmers ahead of the next crop season.
We need urgent reforms in the conversion of Cocoa Board into a lean regulatory authority and aggressive measures to combat illegal mining, what we will now call galamsey here, which has destroyed cocoa farmlands and still destroying more cocoa farms across the country.
As Ibrahim Boateng gets ready for the next cocoa season, he says what farmers need most is confidence that the system will work, because without reliable buyers and timely payments, many could struggle to stay in production. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Betty Airtel plans to boost its stake in its UK-listed African subsidiary through a $2.9 billion share swap. Regulatory filings indicate that the board of the New Delhi-based company on Wednesday cleared the issuance of almost 150 million shares to founder group company Indian Continent Investment on a preferential basis. These shares will be swapped for a 16.3% stake in Airtel Africa before a planned initial public offering of the unit's mobile money business in the second half of this year. The transaction will help the mobile phone service provider owned by billionaire Sunil Mittal get a higher stake in the rapidly growing African unit. Airtel Africa plans to raise as much as $2 billion in the IPO of the mobile money unit. For years, Nigeria's state-owned refineries in the cities of Port Harcourt and Warri have remained largely inactive despite repeated rehabilitation efforts costing billions of dollars. Now, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company is hoping a new partnership with two Chinese firms could finally change the story. It recently signed an MOU with the firms to support the completion of rehabilitation works, improve operations and expand the capacity of the refineries. Here's Deji Bademosi with more on that story.
By some estimates, the Nigerian government has spent roughly $18 billion in the last 20 years trying to get the country's four state-owned refineries to work. In 2021 alone, the government voted around $3 billion to fix both the Port Harcourt and Warri refineries. But after a false start, the refineries remain inactive. A new management now running the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited is counting on a new partnership arrangement with two Chinese firms to get the refineries running again. It signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese firms on a potential technical equity partnership aimed at completing outstanding work at the two refineries, as well as ensuring their long-term operational efficiency.
The NNPC itself has said that this is not a contract-led initiative. In other words, unlike what we used to have in the past, where it's a question of just getting some lump sum of money, awarding contracts to some people to come and fix the refinery. This is a partnership. So what, according to the NNPC, what you have in this particular arrangement is an equity partner. In other words, the partner is coming to take equity, and the partner is also sharing the risk of investing in the refinery. And once somebody has a stake in an investment, that investor will also worry about the outcomes of that investment.
The NNPCL has made it clear the MOU is more or less a statement of intent and that a final agreement will still have to be reached and approved.
One thing that has characterized the refineries over the years has been a lot of corruption, a lot of opaqueness. So we need to see something different under this initiative. So it is very, very important in order to be able to inspire the confidence of the citizens, in order to be able to inspire the confidence of even the economic operators. So that transparency is extremely very important.
So are we okay to give these new guys a chance? Do they have the competence to do what they have been asked to do? Those are questions that we must necessarily ask to give us that confidence that it is possible that these new partners we have signed MOU with would deliver what the other partners we have worked with for 30 years were not able to deliver.
If they are able to resuscitate the refineries, if they did not put in any more money from the purse of the government or from the purse of the NNPC, if the partners are able to inject a lot more funds and bring a lot more technical expertise, and the refineries can work. If the refineries work, of course, there will be more job creation. So what we think this should be that the assets of the refinery will form the equity, and the partners that are coming will now provide both the technical and the financial resources to be able to, resuscitate the refineries.
Despite the concerns, everyone in the country wants the refineries to work. And if the new partnership with the Chinese firms could turn around the fortunes of the moribund refineries, they will be happy to see that happen. Deji Bademasi, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Well, we leave it there for now, but ahead on global business, Chinese President Xi Jinping holds talks with visiting U.S. President Donald Trump at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Both sides have agreed to work towards building a constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability. We'll have more details on that story at the top of the hour. For now, I hand it back to Beatrice.
Penina, thank you. Well, let's now take a look at your sports news. Here's what's ahead. Côte d'Ivoire's Ibrahim Diabate scores a crucial goal as relegation threatened defeat Barcelona in Spain's La Liga.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa.